Chapter 1. Before Christmas. The screen of the ruggedized satellite phone flickered twice, casting a sickly blue strobe light across the walls of a hotel room that felt more like a concrete cell than a suite. Chase Walker exhaled, a sound like gravel shifting. His thumb hovered over the red disconnect button, trembling with a rare, jagged hesitation. Outside the reinforced window, the city of Prague stretched out like an unburied skeleton, ancient and gray, smelling of coal smoke and the impending winter. He was 5,000 miles from the only two people who made the air feel worth breathing. Then, the connection stabilized, and Ella's face filled the screen. "Daddy!" The high-pitched squeal cut through the electronic static like a blade of sunlight through a storm front. Chase's shoulders, usually braced as if expecting an impact, dropped an inch. The phantom weight of his tactical vest seemed to vanish. "Hey, baby girl." He forced a smile, the muscles in his face feeling rusty from disuse. "You're still up? It's way past your bedtime in Virginia." She nodded so hard her dark curls, wild and unruly, just like his used to be, bounced into her eyes. "Mom said I could wait. I had to show you. I made you a present, but it's a flat present so it fits in the phone." She vanished from the frame, replaced by the frantic shuffling of paper and the sound of sneakers skidding on hardwood. When she reappeared, she was holding a drawing up to the lens, so close all Chase could see was the waxy texture of green crayon. "Back it up, Elle. Give me the full gallery view." She obeyed, revealing a lopsided house with a chimney puffing purple smoke. 3 stick figures stood out front, holding hands. The one in the middle had a dress, the one on the left had a giant, scribbled-on beard. Chase swallowed a lump that felt like a stone. "Is that us?" "Uh-huh. That's you, and that's Mommy, and that's me. And that's the snow." She pointed to a chaotic swirl of blue and white at the top of the page. "Because it's almost Christmas. And you're coming home for the cookies, right? The ones with the bells?" The innocence of the question hit him harder than any physical blow he'd taken in the field. "I am," Chase said, his voice dropping to a gravelly vow. "I'm going to be there before the first batch comes out of the oven. I promise, Ella." Cross my heart. Behind the girl, the apartment looked agonizingly warm. He could see the soft glow of the floor lamp he'd repaired 3 years ago, the edge of the frayed rug they'd bought on a whim at a flea market, and the half-decorated Christmas tree standing in the corner like a hopeful sentinel. Then, the warmth of the memory was doused in ice. A man moved through the background. He was tall, wearing a sweater that looked expensive and soft, the kind of clothes a man wears when he doesn't expect to have to run or fight. He carried 2 mugs, moving with a fluid, practiced ease that screamed permanence. He didn't look like a guest. He looked like a resident. Chase's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. "Mom! Daddy's on!" Ella shouted, twisting around. Marnie appeared a moment later. She leaned into the frame to scoop Ella into her lap, her hair pulled back in a messy knot that exposed the elegant, tired lines of her neck. She wasn't wearing makeup, and she didn't need to. To Chase, she still looked like the only steady thing in a spinning world. "Hey," she said. Her voice was guarded, a neutral territory they both inhabited now. "You caught us just before the final countdown to sleep." "Yeah," Chase said, his eyes involuntarily shifting to the man in the background. The man, Elliot, paused. He was leaning against the kitchen island, the one Chase had sanded down by hand the summer Ella was born. He met Chase's gaze through the screen. There was no malice in the man's eyes, only a polite, devastatingly calm sort of pity. He gave a small nod, a man-of-the-house acknowledgement that made Chase want to reach through the pixels and tear the world down. "Who's that?" Chase asked. The warmth was gone, replaced by the cold, clipped tone of a commanding officer. Marnie's expression didn't crumble. It hardened. She tucked a stray hair behind Ella's ear, a protective gesture. "That's Elliot, Chase. We talked about this. I told you he's been helping out." "Helping out," Chase repeated, the words tasting like copper. "Looks like he's doing more than taking out the trash." "Daddy!" Ella's voice was small now, her brow furrowed. "Are you mad at the phone?" "No, sweetheart," Chase said, his heart breaking as he forced his features to soften. "Daddy's it's a long way away and the signal is bad. I'm just tired. I'll give you guys some space." Elliot's voice drifted over. It was a smooth baritone, cultured and calm. "Night, Ella. Don't let the bedbugs bite." "Night, Elman," she chirped. The man disappeared toward the bedrooms, and Chase felt a primal surge of territorial rage that he had to bury under layers of professional discipline. He waited until the footsteps faded before looking at Marnie again. "So," he said. "That was fast." "A year, Marnie? That's all it took to replace the furniture?" Marnie's eyes flashed with a sudden, sharp fire. She turned the phone slightly so Ella, busy rolling up her drawing, wouldn't see her mouth set in a grim line. "It's been a year since you signed the papers, Chase, but it's been 3 years since you were actually here for a holiday." Don't you dare talk to me about time. I was working. I was providing. You were hiding, she countered, her voice a fierce whisper. You took every overseas contract like you were addicted to the distance. You chose the dirt and the guns over the PTA meetings and the broken sink. I took those jobs so you wouldn't have to worry about the mortgage. So Ella could have whatever she wanted. She wanted you. Marnie's voice cracked, and she instantly took a breath to steady it. She looked down at Ella. Baby, go brush your teeth. Use the sparkly toothpaste. Ella hesitated, sensing the electricity in the air, then kissed the screen. Love you, Daddy. Come home fast. Love you more than the stars, Elle, Chase said. As soon as the girl left the room, the silence between the adults became a physical weight. Marnie sat back on the sofa, looking at him with a mixture of exhaustion and a lingering painful chemistry that neither of them could quite extinguish. You don't get to do that, she said quietly. You don't get to show up via satellite and play the jealous husband. You forfeited the right to be jealous when you stopped coming home. I'm coming home now, Chase insisted, leaning toward the camera. This is the last one, Marnie. The payout on this security contract is enough to ground me for good. I'm buying into a local firm. No more deployments. I swear, Marnie let out a dry, hollow laugh. How many times have I heard that? Usually from a burner phone in a desert or a sat-link in a jungle. I mean it this time. Look at me. She did. She searched his face, her eyes lingering on the new scar near his temple, then the hard set of his mouth. For a second, just a heartbeat, the ice thawed. Her gaze softened, and he remembered the way she used to smell like vanilla and rain, and the way her hand felt in his. I hope you do, Chase, she whispered. For her sake, but don't expect the house to look the same when you get here. The screen went black. Chase sat in the dark for a long time, the silence of the hotel room ringing in his ears. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the Vltava River. It looked like a vein of black ink. He felt a sickening sense of vertigo, the realization that while he had been standing still, guarding the perimeter of his life, the life itself had moved on without him. 2 hours later, the emotional ache was replaced by a familiar, cold, professional dread. Chase stood in the back of a sterile, subterranean conference room on the outskirts of the city. The air was over-filtered, tasting of ozone and bleach. Around a massive glass table sat the directors of Ethelgard Holdings, men with manicured nails and souls made of spreadsheets. On the wall, a digital projection showed a microscopic view of a jagged, crystalline structure. The Chimera V strain, a lead researcher was saying. He was a small man named Dr. Eris, who spoke with a terrifyingly clinical enthusiasm. It is, quite simply, the holy grail of prophylactic virology. By accelerating the mutation rate in a controlled environment, we can develop vaccines for viruses that don't even exist in the wild yet. We are staying 10 years ahead of nature. Chase leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. And what happens when nature catches up to your lab? The room went silent. Dr. Eris blinked, his glasses magnifying his eyes into twin pale orbs. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. I thought your expertise was in kinetic security, not pathology. I don't need a PhD to know that if you build a bigger mouse, you eventually end up with a bigger hole in the wall, Chase said, his voice cutting through the corporate jargon. I've seen your containment protocols. They're top-notch on paper, but papers don't get tired at 3 a.m. Papers don't have bad days or get bribed. The council chairman, a man whose suit probably cost more than Chase's first house, cleared his throat. Mr. Walker, your cynicism is noted. However, the simulation data is conclusive. Even in the event of a localized breach, the strain's lifespan outside of a host is less than 6 hours. The mortality rate is capped at 8 to 10%, mostly the elderly and immunocompromised. Chase felt a surge of bile. 8% of the world is 600 million people. That's not a cap, that's an apocalypse. We are talking about preventative measures, Eris snapped. The side effects are minimal. Some mild neurological inflammation, fever, perhaps localized disorientation. A small price for global immunity. Disorientation, Chase muttered. He thought of Ella's drawing. The lopsided house. The blue snow. He thought of the way Elliot had looked at him, the look of a man who was already living Chase's life. The vote was a formality. A sea of expensive pens hit paper, and the fate of the Chimera V strain was sealed. They were moving the samples to the primary distribution hub tonight. As the meeting broke up, Chase followed the team toward the hangar. The tension in his gut wasn't just jealousy anymore, it was the combat itch, that prickling sensation at the base of his neck that preceded an ambush. The hangar was a cavern of corrugated steel and mercury vapor lights. A private Gulfstream sat idling on the tarmac, its engines a low, hungry growl. A new security team was bustling around the cargo, Men in charcoal fatigues, carrying submachine guns with the casual indifference of people who hadn't seen enough real action to be afraid. Chase pulled his phone out. He stared at the darkened screen, at his own reflection. He looked older than 35. He looked like a man who had spent too much time in the shadows. He began to type a message to Marnie. "I'm leaving the site now. Should be at the airport by midnight. I love you both. I'm coming home." He hit send, but the message failed icon popped up. No signal. The hangar's jamming field was already active for the transport. He looked up at the plane. The cargo containers were being loaded. Heavy, pressurized canisters, marked with biohazard symbols that glowed a faint, sickly yellow under the hangar lights. A cold wind swept in from the airfield, carrying the scent of jet fuel and turning the sweat on Chase's neck to ice. He watched the researchers board, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoods. He didn't know that within 72 hours, the disorientation Dr. Eris dismissed would turn the world's cities into slaughterhouses. He didn't know that the minimal side effects included a total collapse of the frontal lobe, leaving nothing behind but a primal, starving hunger. All he knew was that he was on the wrong side of the world, and the distance between him and his daughter was about to become an ocean of monsters. Chase gripped his bag, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed into the gray clouds. "I'm coming home, Ella," he whispered into the wind. "God help anyone who gets in my way." The engines roared to a scream, and the plane began to taxi, a silver needle sewing the shroud of the old world shut. Chapter 2. Containment Failure. Chase. Somewhere over Europe. The cabin of the private Gulfstream smelled of expensive leather and stale espresso, a scent that was rapidly being overtaken by the copper tang of fear. Chase was seated 3 rows back from the research team, his body coiled in a state of relaxed readiness that had become his only default setting. He scrolled through a photo on his phone, Ella in her pajamas, missing 2 front teeth, grinning with a lopsided joy that felt like a relic from another geological era. The piece didn't just break, it shattered. The sound was wet, a ragged, tearing cough that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. Chase's head snapped up. One of the junior researchers, a man in his late 20s named Miller, was doubled over in the aisle. He wasn't just coughing, he was convulsing. His hand was clamped over his mouth, but red ribbons of fluid were already leaking through his fingers, staining his white shirt like a spreading ink blot. "Miller? Hey, breathe," a colleague said, reaching out. Chase was out of his seat before the woman finished the sentence. He moved with a predator's economy, sliding into the aisle. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice a low, resonant rumble that cut through the rising murmurs. Miller's head lolled back. His skin hadn't just gone pale, it had turned a translucent, sickly gray, like wet parchment. Dark, spider-webbing veins stood out in stark relief against his neck, pulsing with a rapid, frantic rhythm. His eyes weren't glassy anymore. They were hemorrhaging, the whites turning a solid, bruised crimson. "He's having a seizure," the flight attendant cried, rushing forward with a first aid kit. "No, he's not," Chase said, his hand going to the small of his back, checking the grip of his concealed sidearm. "This is a systemic collapse." Miller let out a sound, a guttural, wet rattle that ended in a spray of dark blood. He collapsed to the carpet, his body twitching with a violent mechanical energy. The woman across the aisle screamed, a high-pitched sound that set the rest of the passengers off. "Keep your seats," Chase barked, but the panic was a flood. Miller's twitching stopped abruptly. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the dull roar of the jet engines and the sobbing of a researcher in the back. Then, Miller's eyes snapped open. There was no human recognition left. No Miller. Only a raw, electric hunger that seemed to vibrate in the air. He didn't stand. He launched. With a speed that defied the laws of biology, he lunged at the nearest guard, one of the new hires who had been leaning over him. The guard didn't even have time to draw. Miller's teeth sank into the man's throat with a sound like wet leather tearing. "Containment breach," Chase yelled, stepping back to create a kill zone. He didn't draw yet. The cabin was too crowded, the risk of a pressurized blowout too high. The guard screamed, a gurgling, hopeless sound as Miller tore a chunk of muscle from his neck. The cabin devolved into a meat grinder. The other guard panicked, fumbling with his holster, but Miller was already on him, moving like a blur of gray skin and red teeth. Chase grabbed a heavy metal catering tray from the galley. As Miller turned toward him, his jaw hanging open, dripping with the guard's lifeblood, Chase swung. The edge of the tray caught the creature. It wasn't Miller anymore, square in the temple. The impact should have ended the fight. It cracked bone, but the thing didn't even flinch. It just hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and lunged again. Chase kicked him back, his boot connecting with the creature's chest, sending it tumbling into the cockpit door. "Lock it!" Chase screamed at the pilot, who was staring through the open door in paralyzed horror. The door slammed shut a second before Miller's head hit the reinforced wood. Chase looked around the cabin. It was a slaughterhouse. 2 people were down, their blood painting the white leather seats. The other researchers were huddled in the back, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated terror. Then, the first guard, the one with the torn throat, began to twitch. Chase felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over him. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb flying across the screen even as he watched the dead man's fingers claw at the carpet. Marnie. Listen to me. This is not the flu. Marnie, Suburbia, United States. The afternoon sun was slanted across the kitchen table, turning the dust motes into dancing sparks of gold. It was a quiet, domestic scene that felt increasingly like a lie. Marnie sat at the table, her coffee cold, watching Ella color a picture of a reindeer. The TV was on in the background, the volume low, but the images were getting harder to ignore. Reports of a localized outbreak at Heathrow remain unconfirmed, the news anchor was saying, though his tie was loosened and his hair was uncharacteristically disheveled. Authorities are urging citizens to remain in their homes as a precaution. We are seeing similar reports from Paris, Berlin, and Istanbul. Mommy, look, Ella said, holding up a drawing. I gave the reindeer a hat so he doesn't get sick. Marnie's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. That's very smart, baby. Elliot walked into the room, his face illuminated by the glow of his smartphone. He looked annoyed, the way a man looks when his flight has been delayed, not when the world is ending. Total hysteria, Elliot said, shaking his head. My brother just called from DC. He says the Beltway is a parking lot because people think a sneeze is going to turn them into a zombie. It's a respiratory virus, for God's sake. People need to grow up. Marnie didn't answer. She was looking at her own phone. The message from Chase was there. It was short. Brutal. There's been a containment failure. It happened mid-flight. People are attacking each other. This spreads fast. Marnie felt the air leave her lungs. She had spent years hating Chase's paranoia, hating the way he scanned every room for exits, the way he slept with a knife under his pillow. But in this moment, that paranoia felt like the only solid ground she had. Elliot, she said, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. Chase just messaged me. Elliot sighed, leaning against the counter. Marnie, please. The man lives for this. He's probably sitting in a bar in Prague, bored out of his mind, trying to scare you so you'll keep talking to him. He wouldn't lie about this, she snapped, her eyes flashing. Not when Ella is involved. He's a mercenary, Marnie. He's trained to see ghosts in every corner. Marnie ignored him. Her fingers were trembling as she typed back. What's happening? Where are you? The 3 dots appeared almost instantly. You stay put. Do not run. Do not go to hospitals. Do not trust official evacuation orders unless I tell you otherwise. Stockpile water. Canned food. First aid. Board up lower windows. Keep lights off at night. Marnie stood up, her chair screeching against the tile. Ella looked up, her crayon pausing. What is it, Mommy? Nothing, Elle. We're just going to play a game, Marnie said, forcing a smile that felt like it was breaking her face. We're going to have a camp out in the living room tonight. With s'mores? Maybe. But first, I need you to go upstairs and pack your backpack with your favorite toys and 3 pairs of socks. Can you do that? As soon as Ella scrambled out of the room, Elliot turned on her. What are you doing? You're scaring her. I'm listening to the man who knows what a war zone looks like, Marnie said, walking to the pantry and beginning to pull out cans of soup and boxes of pasta. Go to the garage. Get the plywood from the renovation project. We need to cover the back sliding door. Elliot laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. You're serious? You're actually going to board up the windows because your ex-husband sent a text? Marnie stopped, a jar of peanut butter in her hand. She looked at him, really looked at him. Elliot was kind. He was stable. He was everything Chase wasn't. But as she watched him, she realized he was a man built for a world that was currently dissolving. Look at the TV, Elliot, she said quietly. On the screen, a live feed from a traffic camera in Chicago showed a line of cars at a standstill. Suddenly, people began spilling out of their vehicles. They weren't running from something, they were running at each other. A man in a business suit tackled a woman, his teeth going for her shoulder. The camera cut to black. Elliot's face went white. The mug in his hand tilted, spilling lukewarm coffee onto the floor. Marnie's phone buzzed again. I'm gonna be delayed getting home. Borders are already closing. But I am coming. You hear me? I hear you, she whispered to the empty room. Chase, Europe, Day 1. The plane didn't land. It crashed. A controlled descent into a fallow field somewhere on the border of Poland and Belarus. The pilot had been bitten through the cockpit door gap, and Chase had been forced to take the controls for the final 300 feet. He climbed out of the wreckage, his shoulder screaming in pain, his face covered in a mask of soot and dried blood. Behind him, the Gulf Stream was a twisted skeleton of metal, smoke rising into the darkening sky like a funeral pyre. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to save. He began to walk toward the tree line, his eyes scanning the horizon. The world felt different already. The air was colder, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of artillery. Or perhaps it was just the sound of a civilization falling apart. He reached a small village by nightfall. It should have been bustling with the dinner rush, but the streets were empty. A single porch light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the cobblestones. Chase moved through the shadows, his hand on his weapon. He found a gas station that had been looted. The glass was shattered, the shelves stripped bare. He managed to find a half-empty bottle of water and a pack of stale crackers. He sat in the corner of the darkened shop, the only light coming from the screen of his phone. He had one bar of signal. If it comes down to it, and you have to move, you go north. Avoid highways. Avoid crowds. He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. "We'll wait," Marnie replied. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He knew what she was doing. She was trusting him, even though he had given her every reason not to over the years. That trust felt like a physical weight, a debt he had to repay with his life. He looked at the photo she had sent an hour earlier. Elliot was in the background, looking out the window with a look of utter bewilderment. "He thinks I'm overreacting," she texted. Chase's jaw tightened. "You're not. This is going to get worse before it gets quiet." He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the keys. "Quiet?" she asked. "Yeah," he typed. "When most people are gone." He hated himself for saying it, for stripping away the last of her illusions. But in the world that was coming, illusions were a death sentence. He heard a sound from outside, the sound of footsteps, uneven and heavy. Scuff thud. Scuff thud. Chase stood up, sliding his phone into his pocket. He moved to the window, peering through the jagged remains of the glass. A woman was walking down the center of the street. She was wearing a floral dress, her hair pinned back neatly, but she was limping, her left leg dragging at an unnatural angle. As she passed under the flickering porch light, Chase saw her face. Her jaw was gone. Not just broken, but hanging by a single tendon, her tongue lolling against a chest drenched in black fluid. She wasn't looking for help. She was sniffing the air, her head tilting with a predatory curiosity. Chase didn't breathe. He watched her disappear into the darkness, her footsteps fading into the wind. He had 3,000 miles to go, across a continent that was becoming a graveyard. He had no transport, limited ammo, and the entire world was about to become his enemy. But he had a promise to keep. Marnie, Day 2. The first night had been a fever dream of sirens and screaming. By the second morning, the suburbs had fallen into a terrifying, expectant silence. Marnie stood in the kitchen, the windows now covered with heavy plywood. The only light came from a few gaps in the boards, casting thin, golden bars across the floor. Elliot was sitting on the sofa, his head in his hands. He hadn't slept. He looked diminished, the crisp lines of his sweater wrinkled, his face shadowed with stubble. "We should have gone to the community center," he muttered. "They said they had food. They said the National Guard was coming." "They're not coming, Elliot," Marnie said, her voice flat. She was busy filling every empty container in the house with water, jars, thermoses, even the plastic tubs from Ella's toy chest. "If they were coming, they'd be here by now." "You don't know that. You're just listening to a man who wants the world to burn so he can feel important." Marnie stopped, a pitcher of water in her hand. She walked over to him, her shadow stretching long across the room. "Chase doesn't want the world to burn. He just knows that when it does, no one is coming to save you. You have to save yourself." A sharp, frantic banging echoed through the house. Someone was at the front door. "Help, please. Open the door," a woman's voice shrieked, followed by the sound of something heavy slamming against the wood. Elliot stood up, his face lighting up with a desperate hope. "It's Mrs. Gable from down the street. We have to let her in." "No," Marnie said, stepping in front of him. "Marnie, she's 60 years old. She's our neighbor." "Elliot, look at the door." The heavy oak was shuddering under the force of the blows. It wasn't the sound of a woman knocking. It was the sound of a battering ram. The wood began to splinter. A hand, gray, blood-streaked, with fingernails torn to the quick, thrust through a crack in the paneling. It wasn't reaching for the handle. It was clawing at the air, the fingers snapping with a blind, frantic hunger. Elliot recoiled, falling back against the sofa. "Oh God. Oh my God. Get the kitchen knife," Marnie commanded, her voice like iron. "And get Ella. Take her to the crawl space under the stairs. Now." The banging intensified. Another hand joined the first. The door groaned, the hinges screaming as they were pulled from the frame. Marnie grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. She stood in the center of the living room, her heart a drum in her ears, her eyes fixed on the breaking door. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look at it. She knew what it would say. "I am coming." The door gave way with a sickening crack. Mrs. Gable stumbled in. Or what was left of her. Her floral housecoat was shredded, her chest a hollowed-out ruin. She didn't scream. She just hissed, her eyes, those solid, bruised crimson eyes, fixing on Marnie. Marnie raised the iron poker. She didn't feel like a mother or an ex-wife. She felt like a soldier. "Come on then," she whispered, her knuckles white. Chase, the Polish border. Chase stood on a ridge overlooking the highway. Below him, thousands of cars were stalled, a river of steel that led nowhere. People were wandering between the vehicles, some sitting on the asphalt in despair, others trying to carry suitcases across the fields. And among them, the gray-skinned shapes moved with terrifying purpose. The infection wasn't a slow burn. It was an explosion. Chase checked his map. He needed to get to the coast. If he could find a boat, if he could get to the UK, maybe there was a chance. Every second he spent on land was a second he was a target. He looked at his phone. The battery was at 20%. He sent one last message before switching it to power save mode. "I'm at the border. Moving fast. Keep the door locked. I love you." He didn't wait for a reply. He couldn't afford the hope. He turned away from the highway and began to run into the forest, his silhouette disappearing into the lengthening shadows of a world that had forgotten the meaning of Christmas. The adventure hadn't even truly begun. He had an ocean to cross and a gauntlet of the damned to run. But as he moved through the trees, Chase Walker didn't feel fear. He felt a cold, sharp focus. He was a man with a destination, and the world was just something in his way. Chapter 3. The Long Way Home. Chase, the Polish forest. Chase ran until his lungs felt like they had been scrubbed with steel wool. The forest was a labyrinth of clutching pine branches and jagged limestone ridges, a landscape designed to break ankles and spirits alike. He didn't slow down. He couldn't. Behind him, the sounds of the scuff-thud footsteps had multiplied. It wasn't just one woman in a floral dress anymore. It was a pack. They didn't breathe, didn't talk, and didn't tire. They just followed the scent of heat and pulse. Every snap of a twig behind him sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through his nervous system, masking the dull ache in his knees. He moved on instinct, a machine built for one purpose: transit. He dived through a thicket of briars, the thorns tearing at his tactical jacket, and slid down a steep embankment, his boots carving deep furrows in the wet needles. By the time he found a defensible position, a hollowed-out space beneath the roots of a massive, fallen oak, the sky had bruised into a deep, necrotic purple. He crouched in the dirt, chest heaving in shallow, silent pulls. He gripped his combat knife, the serrated edge catching the last of the light. He forced himself to listen. The forest was not silent. It breathed. Somewhere, miles away, a car alarm wailed until its battery died. Closer, something shrieked, a high, oscillating sound that started human and ended in a mechanical rasp. He stayed there for an hour, unmoving, until the cold began to seep into his bones. Only then did he allow the math of his situation to settle in. He was on foot in hostile territory. No allies, no air support, no extraction. And 3,000 miles of a dying world stood between him and the small girl who was currently waiting for him to bring home Christmas bells. He pulled his phone out, shielded the glow with his jacket, and checked the battery. 12%. He didn't check for a signal. He didn't want to know if the towers were dead. He shut it off completely, preserving the last spark of connection like a holy relic. Hope was heavier than ammo in a world like this. He couldn't afford to carry any excess. Europe. Day 3. The speed of the collapse was a masterclass in chaos. Chase skirted the outskirts of a town whose name had been blasted off the road signs by small arms fire. From a ridge, he watched through binoculars as the local military attempted a containment sweep. It was a massacre. Armored vehicles rolled through the cobblestone streets, their loudspeakers barking orders for calm in a language that was being drowned out by gunfire. A line of civilians emerged from a church, hands raised, clutching Bibles and suitcases. In the middle of the line, a boy of about 10 stumbled. He didn't fall. He lunged. He tore into the calf of the priest beside him. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They opened fire with heavy machine guns. They didn't aim for the infected. They aimed for the crowd. The controlled response lasted 5 minutes. The silence that followed lasted much longer. Chase turned away, his stomach knotting. He had seen war, but war had rules. This was just a harvest. By the third night, he found himself part of a grim caravan of the desperate. They had found him in a barn, a French paramedic named Celine, a Bulgarian truck driver named Victor, and 2 university students from Berlin who looked like they had seen the sun go out. They didn't exchange names at first. In the new world, names were a liability, a ghost you had to carry once the person was gone. "We go to the coast," Victor grunted, sharpening a tire iron against a stone. Ships. The water is safe. They cannot swim, yes? They don't breathe, Chase said, cleaning the mud from his boots. If they can't swim, they'll walk along the bottom. But the sea is big. It's a start. They moved for 48 hours, a silent line of shadows. Chase took point, his senses dialed to a razor's edge. He taught them the basics. Aim for the T of the face. Don't scream. If someone is bitten, you don't wait for the fever. The students didn't last. The boy, Lucas, froze when they encountered a group of infected in a narrow mountain pass. One of them was a woman in a nightgown, her jaw hanging by a thread of muscle. Lucas saw a person. Chase saw a biological weapon. Lucas, move! Chase hissed, but the boy hesitated. The woman hit him with the force of a freight train, her teeth snapping shut on his windpipe. His girlfriend screamed, a high, piercing sound that rang through the canyon like a dinner bell. Run! Chase roared, grabbing Celine and Victor by their packs and shoving them forward. They didn't look back. The sounds of Lucas being disassembled and his girlfriend's screams being cut short by a wet gurgle followed them for miles. Celine died that night, not from a bite, but from a scratch she hadn't mentioned. By midnight, she was shaking, her eyes turning that bruised, hemorrhaged red. She looked at Chase, her hands trembling as she handed him her medical kit. Don't let me be like them, she whispered. Chase nodded. He used his knife. He didn't blink, but as he wiped the blade on the grass, he felt another piece of his humanity flake away. Marnie, Suburbia, Day 3. The oak door was a ruin. Mrs. Gable's body lay in the entryway, a silent testament to the fact that the world had ended. Marnie stood over her, the iron fire poker still gripped in her white-knuckled hands. Gore was splattered across her forearms, cooling into a tacky, dark crust. Elliot, get up, she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was cold, echoing the tone Chase used when he talked about operational security. Elliot was slumped against the wall, staring at the body of their neighbor with a look of utter, soul-deep betrayal. You killed her. You didn't even hesitate. She wasn't there anymore, Elliot. Did you see her eyes? Did you see her mouth? Marnie walked to the kitchen, her steps heavy. She turned on the tap. For a moment, she stared at the water, half expecting it to be blood. It ran clear. She scrubbed her arms until the skin was raw. We have to leave, Elliot whispered, his voice cracking. We can't stay in a house with a corpse on the porch. The smell. It'll attract more of them. We're not leaving, Marnie said, turning to face him. Chase said to stay put. He said the highways are death traps. Chase isn't here. He's in a different hemisphere. He's probably dead, Marnie. The slap was loud in the quiet kitchen. Marnie didn't regret it. Don't you ever say that again. Not in this house, not around Ella. She went to the hallway and knelt by the crawlspace. Ella? Baby, it's okay. You can come out now. The small girl crawled out, her face streaked with tears, clutching a stuffed rabbit so hard its seams were popping. She looked at the blood on her mother's shirt, then at the splintered door. Is the sick lady gone? She's gone, baby, Marnie said, pulling her into a fierce hug. She's not gonna hurt us. Marnie spent the next 4 hours dragging Mrs. Gable's body to the far end of the garden and covering it with a tarp. She moved the heavy oak sideboard in front of the broken door, bracing it with 2 X4s she ripped from the closet shelving. She was no longer a woman waiting for her husband to come home. She was a warden of a fortress. Chase, the coast of Poland, Day 6. The harbor city of Gdansk was a funeral pyre. Black smoke smeared the horizon, smelling of burning rubber and roasted meat. Chase moved through the industrial district, his silhouette jumping against the flickering orange light of a dozen uncontrolled fires. He reached the pier at dawn. The water was choked with debris, upturned lifeboats, floating suitcases, and white bloated shapes that he refused to look at too closely. A massive cargo ship, the MS Star of the North, was straining against its moorings. It was half-loaded, its cranes frozen in mid-air. A few sailors were on the deck, firing rifles into a surging crowd on the dock. Chase didn't wait for an invitation. He sprinted. The dock was a gauntlet. The infected were everywhere, drawn to the noise of the ship's engines. One lunged from behind a stack of shipping containers, a dock worker in a high-visibility vest. Chase didn't slow. He ducked under the man's grasp, drove his shoulder into the creature's midsection, and sent him tumbling into the freezing harbor water. Hey! Help! Chase roared, waving his arms as he reached the foot of the gangplank. A sailor pointed a rifle at him. Stay back. We're full. I'm security. I can run your engine room. Chase lied. He didn't know a piston from a spark plug, but he knew how to sound like he belonged. A burst of gunfire from the dock distracted the sailor. A group of the shamblers had broken through the perimeter. Chase took the opportunity and leaped onto the rising ramp. Halfway up, a hand grabbed his ankle. He looked down. It was a woman, her face a mask of red, her fingers digging into his boot with unnatural strength. He kicked out, his heel connecting with her jaw, but she didn't let go. "Die, you bitch," the sailor yelled, firing a shot that grazed Chase's calf before thudding into the woman's head. The weight vanished. Chase scrambled onto the deck, collapsing onto the steel plating. His leg felt like it had been dipped in molten lead. "You're hit," the sailor said, coming over with a grim look. "Graze," Chase rasped, clutching his leg. "Just a graze." The ship lurched, the massive engines groaning as they fought the tide. The gangplank was retracted, leaving 100 screaming, terrified people on the dock. As the ship pulled away, the crowd was swallowed by the gray tide of the infected. Chase watched until the shore was nothing but a line of fire against the gray sea. He was on the water. He was moving west, but the ship wasn't a sanctuary. Within 2 hours, the screaming started in the lower decks. Marnie, suburbs, day 5. The silence of the suburbs was worse than the sirens. It was the silence of a graveyard. No birds sang. No lawnmowers hummed. Occasionally, the distant pop 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 of small arms fire echoed from the direction of the city, but out here, it was just the wind whistling through the gaps in the plywood. Elliot had stopped talking. He sat by the window, staring through a knothole in the wood. He hadn't eaten in 24 hours. "They're broadcasting a signal," he whispered. "FM 98.1. It's the National Guard. They've set up a green zone at the stadium. Food. Medicine. Electricity." Marnie didn't look up from where she was cleaning a handgun, Chase's old Beretta, which she'd found in the floor safe. "It's a trap, Elliot. Think about it. You put 10,000 people in a stadium, one person sneezes, and you've built a slaughterhouse. You don't know that. You're just a cynic because he made you one." Elliot stood up, his eyes bright with a manic, desperate energy. "I can't sit here and wait for the water to run out. I can't wait for that thing to come back for us. The door is reinforced. We have 6 weeks of food if we ration. I'm leaving, Marnie. With or without you." Marnie looked at him, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of pity. He wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't built for a world where the neighbors ate each other. "If you go alone," she said. "I'm staying for Chase." Elliot laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "He's a ghost, Marnie? You're waiting for a ghost." That night, Marnie woke to the sound of the sideboard being moved. She sprinted into the hallway, the Beretta in her hand. The front door was wide open. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of wood smoke and rot. Elliot was standing on the porch, his backpack on, looking out at the dark street. "Elliot, get back inside," she hissed. "I have to try," he said, his voice strangely calm. "Tell Ella I'm sorry." He stepped off the porch and began to jog down the driveway. Marnie watched from the doorway, her heart hammering. The street seemed empty. Then, from the shadows of the neighbors' hedges, a shape emerged. Then another. They didn't run. They drifted toward the sound of his footsteps. "Elliot, run!" Marnie screamed, forgetting the noise. He didn't make it to the end of the block. A group of 4 infected converged on him from the darkness. He went down without a fight, his scream cut short as they swarmed over him like locusts. Marnie slammed the door and shoved the sideboard back into place. She slumped against the wood, the tears finally coming. She didn't cry for Elliot, not really. She cried for the world that allowed a man like him to be destroyed for the crime of being hopeful. The Atlantic, day 12. The MS Star of the North was a ghost ship. The infection had started in the galley and spread through the crew like wildfire. Chase had spent the last week barricaded in the radio room, his leg festering, his mind drifting in and out of a feverish haze. He had survived by sheer, stubborn refusal to die. He had scavenged what he could, bottled water, a few tins of sardines, and he had killed 3 crewmen who had tried to break down his door. The ship was drifting now, the engines having failed 2 days ago. The Atlantic was a cruel mistress. A late-season storm was battering the hull, sending the massive vessel rolling through 30-foot swells. Chase was thrown against the wall, a fresh bolt of agony shooting through his cracked ribs. He looked at the radio. It was dead. The satellite link was gone. He closed his eyes and saw Ella's lopsided house. He saw the purple smoke from the chimney. "I promised," he thought. "I promised." He forced himself to stand. He grabbed a flare gun and a life vest. He moved through the darkened corridors of the ship, the sound of siding footsteps masked by the roaring of the storm. He reached the deck just as a massive wave crashed over the bow. The ship was listing heavily to the port side. It was going down. Chase saw a life raft, one of the hard-shelled canisters, still attached to the rail. He crawled toward it, his fingers numb with cold. As he reached for the release, a shape loomed out of the spray. It was the captain, his face half gone, his uniform rags, He lunged at Chase with a low, wet growl. Chase didn't have his knife. He didn't have his gun. He grabbed the captain's shoulders and used the momentum of the ship's roll to hurl both of them over the railing. He hit the water like it was concrete. The cold was in physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He surfaced, gasping, just in time to see the Star of the North slide beneath the black waves, a giant gurgling into the deep. He found the life raft bobbing in the swell. He hauled himself inside, his muscles screaming, his vision tunneling into a black dot. He lay on the floor of the raft, the rain lashing his face. "Not yet," he whispered to the storm. "Not yet." America, Day 14. The raft washed ashore on the coast of Virginia, under a sky the color of a bruised lung. Chase dragged himself onto the sand, his hands clawing at the grit. He was a skeleton of a man, his clothes rags, his beard matted with salt and blood. He looked up at the pier of a once popular beach resort. The boardwalk was silent. The Ferris wheel stood still against the gray sky, a skeletal circle of rust. He stood up, his legs screaming in protest, and looked toward the horizon. Somewhere, 20 miles inland, was a house with a lopsided chimney, and a woman who was holding a fire poker like a sword. He pulled his phone from his pocket. It was a miracle the ruggedized casing had held. He clicked the power button. 1%. He waited for the signal to find a roaming tower. It flickered. 1 bar. He didn't call. He didn't have the breath. He sent a single text. "I'm home." The phone died as soon as the sent icon appeared. Chase Walker looked at the ruined world before him. He pulled a piece of rebar from a piece of driftwood, tested the weight, and began to walk. "I'm home, Ella," he whispered. Between him and his daughter were 20 miles of monsters. It was the shortest distance he'd had to travel in weeks. He smiled, a cold, jagged thing, and stepped into the shadows of the new America. Chapter 4. I told you I'd come. The quiet before, Marnie had stopped counting days. Time had lost its shape, somewhere between the third night without power, and the morning she realized she no longer flinched at the sound of distant gunshots. The house, what remained of it, had become a husk, a shell of a life that felt like a dream she'd had a century ago. Curtains had been torn down and tacked back up with heavy duct tape to block any sliver of light from escaping at night. Furniture was stacked into jagged barricades that smelled faintly of sweat, stale air, and the copper tang of old fear. The air itself was thick. It carried the constant, cloying scent of wood smoke and something sweet and rotting, as if the world were a wounded animal left to fester in the sun. Ella slept curled against Marnie's side on a mattress they had dragged into the hallway, the only space in the house with no direct line of sight from any window. The girl was thinner now. The soft marshmallow curves of her cheeks had sharpened into angles, but she still breathed with a rhythmic whistling ease that Marnie clung to like a life raft. That tiny sound was proof that the world hadn't entirely soured. Marnie didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the wall, the Beretta heavy in her lap. Her fingers stayed wrapped around the grip, her thumb tracing the safety. Chase had taught her how to hold it years ago, back when danger was a theoretical concept discussed over wine, not something clawing at the oak planks of her front door. "Do not move," his last message had commanded. "Stay hidden. I will come for you." That promise was the only thing keeping the madness at bay. A sound cut through the silence. It wasn't the erratic, mindless thumping of the shamblers. It wasn't the frantic, panicked scrabbling of a desperate survivor. These were footsteps. Controlled. Deliberate. The grit on the porch groaned under a heavy, tactical boot. Marnie's heart hammered against her ribs so hard it was painful. She eased herself away from Ella, her muscles screaming with tension, and rose into a low crouch. She moved to the window, lifting the edge of the plywood no more than a fraction of an inch. A figure stood in the shadows of the porch. Broad shoulders. A rifle slung low. The man was covered in the filth of 1,000 miles. Salt-stained clothes, a beard matted with dust, and eyes that looked like they had seen the bottom of the abyss. A soft knock sounded. 3 taps. A pause. 2 more. The signal they'd used when they were teenagers sneaking out of their parents' houses. "Marnie," a voice rasped. It was a ghost of a sound, rough as gravel, but it was him. Her knees nearly gave way. She tore at the barricades, her fingernails breaking against the wood, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She shoved the sideboard away and threw the bolt. Chase Walker didn't walk in. He drifted in, his eyes scanning the room for threats before they even settled on her. He looked like death's personal messenger. Blood was crusted dark along his jaw, and his left sleeve was stiff with dried fluid. Ella stirred, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "Mommy?" Chase froze. He dropped his rifle to the sling and fell to his knees as the little girl realized who was standing in the foyer. "Daddy!" She hit him like a kinetic projectile. The force of her impact knocked the wind out of him, but he caught her, his massive arms wrapping around her small frame, crushing her to his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking with a single, violent sob that he immediately choked back. "I told you," he whispered into her curls. "I told you I'd come." Marnie stood by the door, her hands over her mouth, watching the impossible happen. Then Ella pulled back, cupping his face with her small, dirty hands. She looked at the scars and the grime with a terrifyingly adult seriousness. "You're late," she said. Chase let out a broken laugh. "I know, Bug. I ran into some traffic." That was when Marnie finally broke. She sank to the floor beside them, the adrenaline draining out of her and leaving a hollow, aching void. She pressed her forehead against Chase's shoulder, smelling the salt, the gunpowder, and the unmistakable, wonderful scent of him. He wrapped a heavy arm around her, pulling the three of them into a single, desperate knot. For a moment, the world outside, the monsters, the fires, the collapse of everything, simply ceased to exist. The peace lasted exactly 6 minutes. A low, vibrating growl echoed from the street, followed by the sound of something heavy slamming into the neighbor's fence. Chase's head snapped up, the tenderness in his eyes replaced instantly by a flat, lethal clarity. "Back of the house, now," he ordered, his voice a low vibration. He stood up, checking the action on his rifle. Through the gaps in the door, Marnie saw them. A swarm. Not a few stragglers, but a concentrated pack of 30 or more, drawn by the scent of a fresh arrival. They were faster than the one she had seen before, mutated, their muscles bulging under gray skin. "Stay down, Marnie. Keep her ears covered," Chase said. He didn't wait for them to break in. He kicked the door open, creating a narrow kill gap. The violence was clinical. Chase didn't scream. He didn't panic. He moved with a rhythmic, terrifying efficiency. Crack. 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 The rifle barked, each shot dropping a gray shape as it tried to squeeze through the opening. Blood splattered the foyer, soaking into the rug where Ella had played with dolls only weeks ago. When the magazine clicked empty, he didn't hesitate. He transitioned to his sidearm, the Beretta barking in the tight space. A creature, a man once, tall and wearing a tattered suit, lunged over the pile of bodies. Chase stepped inside the creature's reach, drove the muzzle of the gun under its chin, and pulled the trigger. The silence that followed was heavy with the smell of cordite. Chase stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his face splattered with black ichor. He looked at the pile of dead things and then at the street. "They'll be back," he rasped. "The noise will draw more. We have to move." He spent the next hour dragging the bodies out and piling them in a grim pyre, dousing them with gasoline from a canister he'd brought. The fire roared to life, a signal and a warning, sending thick black smoke into the moonlit sky. The intimacy of survival. By midnight, the house was resecured, though the air still tasted of smoke. Ella, exhausted by the emotional upheaval, had fallen into a deep, heavy sleep in the center of the barricaded living room. Marnie found Chase in the kitchen, trying to wash the blood from his hands with a gallon of bottled water. He was stripped to his undershirt, the lamplight tracing the new map of scars across his back and ribs. He looked like a man who had been put through a thresher and refused to come out the other side. "Let me," she whispered. She took the cloth from his hand. She washed the grime from his neck, her fingers lingering on the pulse point where his heart beat steady and strong. The tension between them was no longer the jagged edge of divorce. It was the raw, primal pull of two people who had cheated death to find one another. He turned to her, his eyes dark and haunted. "I thought I'd lost you. When the ship went down, I saw you in the water. I saw you everywhere. I was right here," she said, her voice trembling. "I never stopped looking at the door." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He pulled her toward him, and when their lips met, it wasn't a gentle reunion. It was a collision. It was a desperate, starving need to prove they were still made of flesh and blood. He lifted her onto the kitchen counter, his hands sliding under her shirt, finding the heat of her skin. Marnie wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him as close as physics would allow. In the darkness of the ruined kitchen, surrounded by the tools of survival, they found the only thing the virus couldn't touch. Chase's movements were urgent, his breath hot against her neck as he whispered her name like a prayer. He buried his face in the crook of her shoulder, his hands gripping her hips with a possessive strength. It was more than sex. It was a reclamation. As they moved together, the sounds of the dying world outside, the wind, the distant screams, the crackle of the fire, faded into a dull hum. There was only the heat of their bodies, the friction of skin, and the overwhelming electric reality of being alive. Every touch was a defiance. Every gasp was a middle finger to the end of the world. When it was over, they stayed locked together, their foreheads pressed against each other, their breathing sinking in the dark. "I'm never leaving again," Chase whispered, his voice thick with a vow. "I know," Marnie replied, her fingers tangling in his hair. Because I'm not letting you. The last morning, at dawn, the world was a palette of ash and gray. They worked with a silent, practiced synchronicity to pack. Chase's presence changed the room's energy. Where there had been a stagnant dread, there was now a sharp, focused momentum. We go north, Chase said, checking his map. I found a community near the Blue Ridge. High elevation, cold enough to slow them down, and they've got a perimeter that actually holds. Marnie nodded, hoisting her pack. She looked at the kitchen table, at the cold coffee mugs and the drawing Ella had made of the lopsided house. It was just a building now. What about Elliot? Chase asked quietly, looking at the fresh dirt in the backyard. Marnie looked out the window at the tarp-covered mound. He tried, Chase. He really did. He wasn't built for this. He stayed with you when I didn't, Chase said, his jaw tightening. I owe him for that. You paid the debt, Marnie said, reaching for his hand. You came back. They walked out the front door together, stepping over the scorched remains of the barricade. The neighborhood was a graveyard of suburban dreams, burnt-out SUVs, abandoned toys, and doors hanging off hinges. Ella walked between them, her small hands firmly gripped by both. She didn't look at the houses or the shadows. She looked at the road ahead. As they reached the end of the street, Chase paused, looking back one last time at the house where his life used to live. Then he turned his eyes to the horizon, where the sun was struggling to break through the smoke. The world was gone. The old rules were ash. But as Chase felt Marnie's hand squeeze his, he realized that for the first time in years he wasn't running away from anything. He was finally going home. Chapter 5. The World Reduced. The road north was a jagged scar across the throat of the Virginia countryside. It cut through what used to be bustling intersections and quiet cul-de-sacs, places where people had once argued over HOA fees and lawn care. Now it was a cemetery of scorched asphalt and rust-eaten vehicles. Every abandoned sedan and overturned truck told a story of a family that had run out of time or fuel. Chase walked point. That had been decided without a single word being exchanged. It was the old, lethal muscle memory of their marriage, the way they moved when the basement flooded or when a fever spiked at 3 a.m. Except now, the basement was the world, and the fever was a plague that turned neighbors into predators. Marnie followed with Ella, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's backpack strap. It wasn't a grip of restraint, but a tether, a constant tactile promise that the center would hold. Behind them, their ragtag group followed in a loose, watchful line. The world felt smaller now. The horizon had shrunk to the distance. Chase could see through his optics, and the distance Marnie could reach with her blade. Everything that didn't matter, the bills, the careers, the petty grievances of a year spent apart, had fallen away like burnt skin, leaving only the raw, tender reality of survival. The watch. They made camp as the sun began to bleed out behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. They found a shallow dip off the main road, shielded by a dense thicket of old-growth oak and tangles of wild blackberry. Chase moved like a shadow, setting up trip lines and silent alarms made of fishing line and scavenged soda cans. Marnie watched him from the fire, a tiny, smokeless blaze tucked deep in a pit. She watched the way his tactical vest hugged his broad chest, the way his movements were devoid of any wasted energy. He was a man built for the end of time, and yet when he glanced back at Ella, his face softened into something so vulnerable it made Marnie's throat tight. That night, Marnie took the second watch. She sat with her back against a fallen log, the cold weight of the rifle across her lap. The stars were terrifyingly bright, stripped of the light pollution that had once veiled the sky. Chase lay a few yards away, his body coiled even in sleep. He didn't sprawl, he waited. When her shift ended, she leaned over and pressed her hand to his shoulder. She didn't nudge him with a boot. She wanted to feel the heat of him. His eyes snapped open instantly. There was no grogginess, just a flash of silver-blue intensity before he recognized her. "Hey," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to thrum right through her fingertips. "Your turn," she whispered. He didn't get up immediately. He reached out, his hand sliding up her arm to the nape of her neck, drawing her down. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of grounding. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch rough and calloused, yet impossibly steady. "You did good today," he said. "I just kept walking, Chase. That's the hardest part." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. In the silence of the woods, with the breathing of their daughter and the other survivors as a backdrop, the intimacy was a heavy, intoxicating thing. She felt the absence of his touch like a physical chill when she finally settled into his bedroll, the fabric still holding the scent of wood smoke and the musk of his skin. The new tribe, the group had grown with the strange, gravitational pull of the desperate. First, there was Frank and Lila, an older couple who had survived the first wave by barricading themselves in a cellar with 20 cases of canned peaches and a double-barreled shotgun. Frank walked with a permanent limp, his face a map of stubborn survival. Lila was the sharp one, her eyes constantly scanning for the rot heads, her tongue a whip that kept the younger ones in line. "You too," Lila had said on the third day, pointing a bony finger at Chase and Marnie. "You move like you're sharing the same nervous system." "It's unnerving." "We've had practice," Chase replied, never taking his eyes off the tree line. Then came Rowan, a former ER nurse with hands that didn't shake, and eyes that had seen too much. She carried a medical bag like it was a holy relic. When she saw Ella, she didn't ask questions. She just checked the girl's vitals and took her place in the middle of the pack. Finally, there was Noah. They had found the 8-year-old boy under a collapsed overpass, clutching a kitchen knife and a sodden teddy bear. He didn't speak, but he clung to Ella's shadow. The group was a microcosm of a world trying not to die. There were no debates about politics or the old ways. There was only the weight of the packs and the distance to the next water source. The fracture, the argument came on the 5th night, a slow boil eruption of years of resentment that the apocalypse had suppressed but not extinguished. They were scouting a ridge overlooking a stagnant valley when Marnie stopped. The exhaustion had finally breached her walls. "You don't get to do it again, Chase," she said, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp anger. Chase stopped, his hand dropping to his sidearm. "Do what?" "Disappear. You're here now. Playing the hero, playing the protector. But you left us. You chose the contracts. You chose the distance." Chase turned, his jaw set so tight the muscles pulsed. "I was working, Marnie. I was building a life for you. You were building a fortress where no one lived," she snapped. "I didn't need a payout. I needed a husband." Ella needed a father, who wasn't a voice on a satellite phone. The silence that followed was more violent than the gunfire. Chase stepped toward her, his shadow looming large in the twilight. "I didn't know how to be that man. Every time I came home, I felt like a ghost. I felt like I was breaking the very thing I was trying to save. So you just stayed away?" "I stayed away because I was terrified that if I stayed, you'd realize I was hollow." He exhaled, a long, jagged sound. "But then the world fell apart, and the only thing that felt real, the only thing that wasn't hollow, was the thought of getting back to you." Marnie's anger evaporated, replaced by a devastating clarity. They had spent years fighting each other when they were really just fighting their own shadows. She stepped into his space, her hands grabbing the front of his vest. "Don't be a ghost anymore, Chase. I'm here," he vowed, his voice breaking. "I'm right here." The sanctuary of the lake appeared on the 6th morning, a sheet of hammered silver beneath the mist. It was tucked into a high valley, surrounded by steep granite cliffs that acted as natural fortifications. In the center sat an island, small and emerald green, with the ruins of a stone lodge peeking through the pines. "The island," Frank whispered, leaning on his cane. "It's got a clear line of sight in every direction. No one's getting to us there without a boat." Chase found a rowboat among the reeds, half submerged. He cleared the silt, checked the oars, and looked at Marnie. The unspoken promise of Chapter 1, the promise to be home before Christmas, was finally within reach. But as the group began the slow process of ferrying supplies, a different kind of hunger took hold between Chase and Marnie. The union. They secured the stone lodge by mid-afternoon. While the others set up sleeping quarters in the main hall, Chase and Marnie found a small room on the upper floor, its window overlooking the water. The door clicked shut, and the world, the dead, the dying, the endless road, was finally locked outside. Chase turned to her. The adrenaline of the journey had settled into a heavy, pulsing heat. He reached for her, his hands sliding into her hair, pulling her head back so he could look into her eyes. "Marnie," he breathed. It started with an intensity that was almost frantic. They stripped away the layers of tactical gear and stained clothes, the armor they had worn against the world. When his skin finally met hers, it was a revelation. He pushed her back against the cool stone wall, his mouth finding the sensitive curve of her neck. Marnie let out a low, jagged moan, her fingers digging into the hard muscles of his shoulders. She needed the weight of him. She needed the proof of his life to drown out the memory of the death they had walked through. Chase moved with a reverence that was almost painful. He traced the lines of her body as if he were memorizing a map of a country he had been exiled from for too long. He kissed the scars on her hands, the tension in her brow and the pulse that beat frantically in the hollow of her throat. When he entered her, it wasn't just a physical act. It was a reclamation of every second they had lost. Marnie arched against him, her breath hitching as she felt the sheer, overwhelming power of him. He was her anchor, her shield, her home. They moved together in the fading light, a slow, rhythmic dance of skin and shadow. Every touch was an admission, every gasp a confession. Chase buried his face in her hair, his hands gripping her hips with a fierce, desperate possessiveness. He wasn't the mercenary now, and she wasn't the grieving survivor. They were just two people who had survived the end of the world, to find that the only thing left worth having was each other. In the quiet aftermath, as the moon rose over the lake, Chase held her close, his heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm against her back. "We stay here," he whispered into the dark. "Yes," Marnie replied, her eyes closing as she finally let the weight of the world go. "We stay." The new dawn, the morning brought a light that felt different, cleaner somehow. Chase stood on the shore of the island, watching as Frank and Rowan organized the small garden they were planning to plant. Ella and Noah were by the water's edge, skipstones across the glassy surface. Marnie came up behind him, sliding her arms around his waist. "Is it enough?" she asked. Chase looked at the island, the water, and the family they had gathered from the ruins. He looked at the woman in his arms, the woman who had become the fiercest thing he knew. "It's everything," he said. The world had ended, but here, in the reduced reality of the lake, something new was beginning. It wasn't the life they had planned, and it wouldn't be easy. There were still monsters in the woods and winters to survive. But as the sun rose over the Blue Ridge, Chase Walker knew he was no longer late. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Chapter 6. After the end. The weight of peace, the island taught them a new architecture of time. In the old world, seconds had been dictated by digital pings, deadlines, and the frantic hum of a civilization that never slept. On the island, time was measured in the rhythmic scrape of a whetstone against a blade, the slow rotation of the stars, and the distance between the last watch and the first light. Chase marked the hours by threat level. He stood on the balcony of the stone lodge, his binoculars scanning the far shore where the mist clung to the pines like a shroud. He looked for the stutter, the jerky, unnatural gait of the infected that broke the fluid grace of the forest. He looked for the smoke of other fires, for the glint of sun on a rifle scope. Peace, he knew, was just the space between two battles. Marnie measured time by Ella. She watched the way her daughter's laughter returned in increments, not the shrill, hysterical sound of a child in shock, but the soft, bubbling mirth of a girl who had found a reason to hope. She watched the way Ella's nightmares shifted from screaming terrors to quiet whimpers, and then, finally, to silence. "Do you think the fish are lonely?" Ella asked one morning, sitting on the edge of the dock, with her feet dangling over the water. Chase, who was cleaning a stringer of perch, paused. "I think they're too busy swimming to be lonely, Bug." "I'm not lonely anymore," Ella decided, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Because you're here. And Mommy's here. And the island is like a big hug." Chase dropped the knife and pulled her into his side, his eyes stinging. He had survived the collapse of nations and the frozen depths of the Atlantic, but it was a 7-year-old's logic that finally brought him to his knees. The growing circle. The island had started with 9 souls. By the end of the first month, it held 15. They came across the water in stolen canoes and makeshift rafts, drawn by the smoke of the lodge and the rumor of a man who knew how to hold a perimeter. Chase's rules remained ironclad. No one landed until Rowan cleared them for bites. No weapons allowed inside the lodge. Everyone worked. Everyone watched. A group of 3 arrived in the second month, a mechanic named Elias, his wife, and their teenage son. They brought news from the mainland that turned the air cold. "The cities are silent," Elias said, his voice hollow as he sat by the great hearth. "The military tried to gas the centers, but it didn't kill them. It just made them different. They don't roam as much now. They wait. They've started nesting in the subways and the malls." Chase listened, his face a mask of granite. "And the government?" Elias let out a dry, jagged laugh. "The government is a radio broadcast on a loop telling people to stay calm. There is no one coming, Walker. This is it." Were the after credits. Marnie looked at Chase. The truth didn't break her, it hardened her. She saw the way Chase's hand found the hilt of his knife, the way his mind was already calculating the defensive implications of nesting predators. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the architects of a new world. The intimacy of the night, that night after the lodge had settled into the uneasy quiet of 20 people breathing in the dark, Chase and Marnie took the final watch. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, carrying the scent of drying pine needles and cold water. They sat on the roof of the lodge, huddled together under a heavy wool blanket. "You're thinking about what Elias said," Marnie whispered, her hand sliding into his. "I'm thinking about how much ammo we have left," Chase admitted. "I'm thinking that a nest means a colony, and a colony eventually needs to expand." Marnie turned to him, her face illuminated by the silver spill of the moon. "Look at me, Chase. Stop being a soldier for 10 minutes. He turned, his brow furrowed, but the hardness in his eyes melted as he looked at her. He reached out, his hand tracing the line of her throat, his thumb lingering on her pulse. The sensuality between them had changed. It was no longer the desperate, starving heat of their first night back together. It was something deeper, a slow-burn connection that felt as ancient as the stone beneath them. He pulled her closer, his lips finding the sensitive hollow behind her ear. Marnie let out a long, shaky breath, her body molding against his. Despite the tactical vest and the cold air, she felt the electric heat of him. He kissed her deeply, a slow, thorough exploration that tasted of salt and coffee and a decade of unsaid things. His hands moved with a heavy, confident grace, sliding under the hem of her sweater to find the soft, warm curve of her waist. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this again," she whispered against his mouth. "This, peace. It's not peace," Chase murmured, his voice a low vibration in his chest. "It's just us. The world can burn, Marnie. As long as I have this, I'm not lost." They moved together in the shadows of the roof, a rhythmic, private dance of skin and breath. Every touch was a tether, every low moan a defiance of the silence that had swallowed the rest of the planet. In the darkness, with the lake whispering against the shore below, they weren't survivors of an apocalypse. They were just a man and a woman, rediscovering the only truth that had ever mattered. The first winter. The winter came with a brutal, white-out fury. The lake froze into a jagged sheet of ice, turning their natural moat into a highway. Chase and the men spent their days reinforcing the shoreline with sharpened stakes and trip flares made of scavenged magnesium. Food became the primary enemy. They lived on dried fish, root vegetables from the cellar, and the occasional deer that Chase managed to track through the snow. Frank passed away in the middle of January. He died in his sleep, his hand in Lila's, his face finally free of the grimace of pain his hip had caused him for months. They couldn't dig a grave in the frozen earth, so they placed him in a stone cairn on the highest point of the island, overlooking the valley. "He liked the view," Lila said, her voice steady despite the tears freezing on her cheeks. "He always said this place was the closest he'd ever get to heaven without dying." I guess he was right. The funeral changed the mood of the colony. It reminded them that even without the virus, time was a thief. The promise kept. On the night of the winter solstice, the air was so cold it seemed to crackle. Marnie found Chase in the workshop, a small room at the back of the lodge heated by a wood stove. He was hunched over a workbench, his hands moving with a meticulous focus. "What are you doing?" she asked, stepping inside. He looked up, his eyes weary but bright. He held up a small, hand-carved wooden horse, its mane made of frayed rope, its eyes two small, polished pebbles. "I told her I'd be home for Christmas," Chase said. "I missed the date. I missed the bells. But I'm not missing this." Marnie walked over and rested her head on his shoulder. "You're 17 days late for Christmas, Walker. I think she'll forgive you." "I'm not just late, Marnie. I'm different. I look in the mirror and I don't see the man who left." "Good," Marnie said, turning him around. "The man who left wouldn't have survived the first day. The man who came back, he's the one we needed." She kissed him, a lingering, soft contact that tasted of wood smoke. "We made it, Chase. Look at us. We're alive." She's happy. "We have a home." He looked at her, really looked at her, and finally, the last of the tension in his shoulders dropped. He let out a long breath, a plume of white in the cold room. "Yeah," he said. "We made it." The new world. Spring returned to the Blue Ridge with a tentative, green hope. The ice on the lake cracked with the sound of a gunshot, and the water turned from gray to a brilliant, life-giving blue. The first sprouts of the garden pushed through the mud, and the birds returned to the pines, their songs filling the morning air. Chase stood on the dock, watching Ella and Noah try to catch minnows with a tattered net. Marnie stood beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. On the far shore, a group of the infected wandered out of the trees. They were thin, their skin hanging off their bones, their movements sluggish and aimless. They looked at the island, let out a hollow, raspy hiss, and then turned back into the woods. They were the past. The island was the future. Chase looked down at the wooden horse in Ella's hand, then back at the woman beside him. The world he had known was gone, the sat phones, the contracts, the cities of glass and steel. But in the wreck of the old world, he had found something he had never truly possessed in the old life. He had found a reason to stay. "You okay?" Marnie asked, sensing his shift in mood. Chase smiled. A real one, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. He leaned down and kissed her, a deep, anchoring promise. "I'm home," he said. And as the sun rose over the mountains, bathing the island in a warm, golden light, the word didn't sound like a destination anymore. It sounded like a beginning.